There's a specific difference between people who maintain psychological stability across varying circumstances and those who experience emotional volatility based on external events. The stable person experiences the same challenges, setbacks, and provocations as the volatile person. The difference isn't in what happens to them. It's in how their psychological systems process what happens. Most people operate with reactive psychological architecture. External events trigger emotional responses. Emotional responses drive behavioral reactions. They're essentially automated systems running predetermined patterns. Insult triggers, anger triggers, defensive response. Failure triggers, shame triggers withdrawal. Uncertainty triggers anxiety, triggers avoidance. This reactive architecture creates predictable vulnerability. Anyone who understands your trigger response patterns can manipulate your behavior by engineering appropriate triggers. You're not in control of your responses. Your automated patterns are. Niccolò Machiavelli observed that leaders who maintained composed psychology, regardless of circumstances, held stronger positions than those whose emotional states fluctuated based on events. The prince who remained calm during crisis commanded better than the prince who panicked. Not because calm princes faced easier circumstances, but because they developed psychological architecture that didn't automatically react to circumstances. This composed psychology isn't personality trait you're born with. It's developed capability built through deliberate practice. You can construct psychological architecture that remains stable across varying circumstances rather than reacting automatically to events. Most people never attempt this construction because they believe their emotional reactions are automatic and unchangeable. "That's just how I am" becomes justification for reactive patterns they could actually modify through systematic work. But examine people who maintain psychological stability across challenging circumstances. They're not experiencing different emotions from reactive people. They're processing those emotions differently. They experience anger without automatically expressing it. They feel fear without automatically avoiding. They notice disappointment without letting it determine their self-concept. This separation between emotional experience and behavioral response is core capability. You can feel strong emotions while maintaining behavioral control. You can process challenging situations while maintaining composed external presentation. You can experience difficulty while maintaining strategic approach. What follows are 7 principles for developing psychological architecture that maintains stability across circumstances. Each represents specific capability you can build through focused practice. Together, they create integrated system for psychological sovereignty, genuine autonomy in how you respond to circumstances rather than automated reactivity. Type this in the comments. I build psychological sovereignty. How others perceive you significantly influences how they interact with you, not because perception determines reality, but because people respond to their perceptions rather than to complete information about actual reality. Their behavior toward you is based on what they believe about you, which is based on what they observe of your presentation. This creates specific strategic opportunity. You can influence others' perceptions through deliberate presentation choices. Not deception about fundamental facts, but strategic choices about what aspects of yourself you emphasize in different contexts. Machiavelli was explicit about this. Appearance matters more than most people acknowledge. The prince who appeared strong maintained better position than the prince who was strong but appeared weak. Not because appearance is more important than substance, but because most people interact with appearance rather than investigating substance. Applied personally, you can develop genuine capabilities while being strategic about how you present those capabilities. Someone might be developing expertise while presenting modest uncertainty. Someone else might have limited expertise while presenting confident mastery. Both presentations create different interaction patterns regardless of actual capability levels. The strategic operator develops genuine substance while managing how that substance appears to others. This isn't about dishonesty. Lying about actual capabilities eventually gets exposed and damages credibility. It's about strategic choices around presentation timing and emphasis. For instance, you might have significant uncertainty about new endeavor while presenting composed confidence during initial stages. You're not lying about your uncertainty. You're choosing not to broadcast it, because broadcasting uncertainty would undermine your position without serving any strategic purpose. Over time, as capability develops and uncertainty decreases, your presentation gradually aligns with reality. But during development phase, strategic presentation maintains stronger position than complete transparency about all doubts and limitations would. The key is maintaining genuine developmental work behind the strategic presentation. If you're presenting confidence without doing actual work to build competence, the gap eventually becomes evident. But if you're genuinely building competence while strategically managing how your development process appears to others, you maintain stronger position throughout development. Most people either present completely transparently, broadcasting all uncertainty and limitation, or they present dishonestly, claiming capabilities they don't have. The strategic approach is different. Genuine development with strategic presentation that emphasizes developing strengths while not unnecessarily highlighting current limitations. This requires comfort with some gap between your internal experience, which includes all doubts and limitations, and your external presentation, which emphasizes capability and minimizes limitation display. That gap isn't dishonesty. It's strategic communication. Emotional experience is largely automatic. Situations trigger emotional responses based on how your brain interprets those situations. You don't choose to feel anger when insulted or fear when threatened. These responses emerge automatically from deep psychological systems. Behavioral response to emotions is different. How you express or act on emotions can be managed through conscious control. You can feel angry without expressing anger. You can experience fear without avoiding what triggered it. You can notice disappointment without letting it drive decisions. This separation between automatic emotional experience and managed behavioral response is fundamental to psychological sovereignty. You're not trying to eliminate emotions or suppress them unhealthily. You're developing capability to feel emotions without automatically acting on them. Machiavelli observed that leaders who maintained behavioral control, regardless of emotional activation, held stronger positions. The general who felt fear but continued strategic command performed better than the general who let fear drive panicked decisions. Same emotional experience, different behavioral management. The capability develops through repeated practice in progressively challenging situations. Start with low-stakes emotional activation, mild frustration, minor disappointment. Practice maintaining composed behavior despite internal emotional experience. Notice the emotion, acknowledge it, then choose behavioral response based on what would be effective rather than what emotion compels. As capability develops with low-stakes practice, gradually work toward higher-stakes situations with more intense emotional activation. The progression builds reliable capacity to maintain behavioral control even during significant emotional experience. Most people skip this progressive development and try to maintain control during high-stakes emotional situations without having built the capability through low-stakes practice. This often fails, reinforcing their belief that emotional control isn't possible for them. But with systematic practice starting at appropriate difficulty level, most people can develop substantial emotional regulation capability, not eliminating emotional experience but managing behavioral response to that experience. The practical application. In professional contexts, maintaining composed presentation during high-stress situations, even when experiencing significant anxiety. In personal contexts, maintaining thoughtful communication during conflicts even when experiencing anger. In both cases, the emotions are present and felt. The behavioral expression is managed. Strategic operators develop reliable emotional regulation that functions across contexts. They're not suppressing emotions unhealthily. They're processing emotions while maintaining behavioral control. This creates substantial advantage in any context requiring composed operation despite emotional activation. Most people operate with bias toward immediate action. When they want outcome, they want to act toward it immediately. When they experience problem, they want to solve it now. When they feel emotional urgency, they want to discharge it through action. This immediate action bias often produces suboptimal results. Acting before timing is right strategically frequently produces worse outcomes than waiting would have. Acting based on emotional urgency rather than strategic timing often means using suboptimal approach. Strategic patience is capability to wait when waiting serves objectives, even when emotional urgency pushes toward immediate action. This isn't procrastination, that's avoidance motivated by fear or discomfort. Strategic patience is disciplined delay waiting for better timing or better approach to emerge. Machiavelli observed that leaders who waited for favorable conditions before acting achieved better outcomes than leaders who acted whenever emotional pressure or external demands required immediate response. The general who waited for advantageous battle conditions won more consistently than the general who fought whenever circumstances demanded it. Developing this capability requires practice, distinguishing between emotional urgency and strategic timing. Emotional urgency feels like, I need to do something now. Strategic timing assesses, when would action produce best outcome? Sometimes these align. Strategic timing indicates immediate action while you also feel emotional urgency. But often they diverge. You feel emotional pressure to act while strategic assessment suggests waiting would produce better results. Building strategic patience means learning to wait during these divergent situations despite emotional discomfort. You feel urgency to act, but maintain discipline to wait for better timing. This feels difficult initially because emotional urgency is uncomfortable. But with practice, capability develops. You become more comfortable with emotional urgency while maintaining behavioral patience. The urgency doesn't disappear, but you develop capacity to feel it without automatically acting on it. Practical applications. In negotiations, not accepting first offer despite anxiety to close deal. In conflicts, waiting for emotions to stabilize before engaging rather than confronting immediately. In professional contexts, developing capabilities before pursuing opportunities rather than pursuing when you first feel excited. In each case, there's emotional push toward immediate action. Strategic patience maintains discipline to wait for better timing. Over time, this produces substantially better outcomes than immediate action bias would have. Every piece of information you share about yourself, your plans, your thinking, or your circumstances is intelligence you're providing to whoever you're communicating with. The more complete information you provide, the more completely others can predict your likely responses and potential vulnerabilities. Most people over-communicate. When asked questions, they provide complete answers with full context. When sharing plans, they explain every detail and consideration. When describing situations, they give comprehensive accounts, leaving little ambiguous. This complete transparency seems honest and authentic. It also makes you highly predictable. When people have complete information about your reasoning processes, they can predict your likely decisions. When they understand your full psychological framework, they can anticipate your responses. This predictability reduces your negotiating power and strategic flexibility. Machiavelli was explicit. Selective disclosure maintains stronger position than complete transparency. The advisor who revealed complete thinking gave others roadmap for influence. The advisor who shared conclusions while keeping reasoning private maintained stronger position. Strategic information management means being deliberate about what you share and what you keep private. Not dishonesty about direct questions, but selectivity about volunteering complete information. In professional contexts, this might mean stating decisions without explaining complete reasoning process. I've decided to do X provides less leverage for negotiation than I've decided X because of A, B, and C. The second provides 3 potential negotiation points by revealing your reasoning. In personal contexts, this might mean maintaining some privacy about your complete emotional process. Sharing that you're working through something without detailing every consideration maintains appropriate boundaries while communicating honestly. The key is distinguishing between honesty and complete transparency. Honesty means not lying when asked directly. Complete transparency means volunteering all potentially relevant information. You can be completely honest while being strategically selective about what information you volunteer. This requires overcoming conditioning that equates selective disclosure with dishonesty. Many people believe authenticity requires sharing everything. But selective disclosure is just strategic communication, sharing what advances your objectives while protecting what would weaken your position if disclosed. Most people err toward over-disclosure because they're uncomfortable with ambiguity, and they've been taught that transparency is always virtuous. But strategic operators recognize that some information serves you better kept private than shared. The discipline is evaluating each potential disclosure. Does sharing this information serve my interests? If yes, share appropriately. If no, maintain privacy. This creates a sustainable pattern of strategic communication rather than automatic complete transparency. Most people focus on process, effort, appearance, and intentions. They measure success by how hard they worked, how proper their methods were, or how good their intentions remained. They want credit for trying even when results don't materialize. Strategic operators focus on actual outcomes achieved. They measure success by results produced rather than effort expended or intentions held. This creates a fundamentally different approach to evaluation and adjustment. Machiavelli was explicit about outcome primacy. The prince who maintained proper procedures while losing territory was less effective than the prince who achieved desired outcomes through unconventional methods. Results matter more than process adherence. This outcome focus changes how you approach situations. Instead of asking, "Am I doing this correctly?" you ask, "Is this producing the result I want?" Instead of focusing on proper procedure, you focus on effective procedure. When current approach isn't producing desired outcomes, outcome focus drives adjustment. You're not attached to specific methods, you're attached to achieving results. If one approach isn't working, you try different approach. If one strategy isn't effective, you develop new strategy. Most people resist this because they've invested in their current approach and they want their effort to count, regardless of results. They've been taught that good process should produce good results, so when results aren't good, they assume they need to try harder using same process. Outcome focus recognizes that effort doesn't guarantee results. Good process usually helps, but ultimately what matters is whether you're achieving desired outcomes. If not, something needs to change regardless of how much effort you've invested in current approach. Practical applications. In professional contexts, measuring progress by actual impact rather than hours worked. In personal development, assessing growth by capability improvement rather than effort expended. In relationships, evaluating health by actual quality rather than time invested. This requires honesty about results. You have to acknowledge when current approach isn't working, even when you've invested significantly in it. That acknowledgement allows adjustment that effort-focused approach would resist. Strategic operators maintain clear focus on outcomes while remaining flexible about methods. They achieve objectives consistently because they adjust approaches based on what's actually working rather than persisting with approaches that feel right but don't produce results. Your attention and presence are valuable resources. Where you allocate them significantly impacts both what you accomplish and how others value your engagement. Most people allocate presence based on social obligation or habit rather than strategic assessment of where presence creates value. This creates pattern where they're highly present in contexts that don't serve them well, while underpresent in contexts that could be highly valuable. They attend everything they're invited to, respond to every request, remain available to everyone regardless of whether that presence serves objectives. Strategic presence calibration means being selective about where you invest attention and engagement. You're highly present in contexts that advance objectives or relationships that matter. You're strategically absent from contexts that don't serve you well even when social pressure suggests you should attend. Machiavelli observed that leaders who maintained selective visibility, rather than constant availability, held stronger positions. The advisor who was sometimes unavailable had his limited time valued more highly than the advisor who was always accessible. This pattern extends beyond formal power contexts. In any relationship or professional setting, the person who's constantly available becomes taken for granted. Their presence loses value through oversupply. The person who's selectively present maintains higher value through scarcity. The strategic operator assesses, does this context deserve my presence, Will my engagement here advance objectives that matter? If yes, be fully present. If no, be appropriately absent despite social pressure to attend. This requires comfort with disappointing people whose expectations you're not meeting. Social conditioning creates pressure to be available whenever requested. Strategic presence means declining requests that don't serve you well, even when declining creates mild social friction. Practical applications. Professionally, attending meetings that matter while declining those that don't despite expectation of attendance. Personally, investing deeply in relationships that provide mutual value while reducing investment in relationships that drain more than they provide. The key is making deliberate choices about presence rather than defaulting to availability. Your time and attention are genuinely limited resources. Allocating them strategically produces better outcomes than distributing them equally across all requests. Most people never establish this selectivity because they want to be accommodating, and they fear social consequences of declining. Strategic operators accept that you can't maximize value creation while maximizing accommodation. Choices about presence allocation are necessary. Psychological sovereignty requires ongoing evaluation of whether your current patterns are serving you well or whether they need adjustment. Most people develop patterns that work in certain contexts, then maintain those patterns indefinitely, even when contexts change enough that patterns are no longer optimal. This creates gradual decline in effectiveness. The approach that worked previously stops working, but they don't notice because they're not systematically evaluating results. They keep using familiar patterns even as those patterns produce diminishing returns. Strategic self-assessment means regularly stepping back to evaluate. Are my current approaches producing desired outcomes? Have circumstances changed in ways that suggest I should adjust? What's working that I should do more of? What's not working that I should modify? Machiavelli emphasized that effective leaders maintained flexibility, adjusting strategies based on changing circumstances. The leader who rigidly maintained previously successful approaches eventually failed when circumstances evolved. The leader who continuously adjusted maintained effectiveness. This applies personally. Your psychological patterns should evolve as you develop capability and as circumstances change. The emotional regulation that works in early career might need refinement as responsibilities increase. The information management appropriate for certain relationships might need adjustment as those relationships evolve. The discipline is establishing regular review cycles. Monthly or quarterly, assess systematically. How am I doing at managing perception? Is my emotional regulation functioning well? Am I exercising appropriate strategic patience? Is my information management serving me well? Am I maintaining outcome focus? Is my presence calibrated appropriately? This systematic review reveals patterns that need adjustment before they create significant problems. You notice declining effectiveness early enough to correct, rather than discovering it after substantial decline. Most people resist this because they want to believe they've figured out right approach and can now just execute it indefinitely. But effectiveness requires ongoing calibration, not one-time optimization. Strategic operators accept that psychological sovereignty is ongoing practice rather than achieved state. They continuously evaluate and adjust their psychological architecture based on what's working in current circumstances, rather than assuming past approaches remain optimal. This creates adaptive advantage. When circumstances change, they adjust psychological approaches accordingly, rather than persisting with patterns that no longer serve them well. This sustained effectiveness over time separates strategic operators from those who peak early then plateau. The pattern is clear. Psychological sovereignty requires specific capabilities developed through deliberate practice. Strategic perception management rather than unmanaged transparency. Emotional regulation separating experience from behavioral response. Strategic patience rather than immediate action bias. Information management discipline rather than automatic disclosure. Outcome focus rather than process attachment. Selective presence rather than constant availability. Continuous self-assessment rather than static patterns. These capabilities create integrated psychological architecture that maintains stability across varying circumstances. You're not eliminating emotional responses or becoming cold and disconnected. You're developing capacity to process challenges while maintaining composed operation. Machiavelli operated in an environment where psychological instability was exploitable weakness. Leaders who reacted emotionally could be manipulated through appropriate provocations. Leaders who lacked strategic patience made predictable errors. Leaders who overdisclosed created vulnerabilities. Opponents exploited. His solution was building psychological architecture that remained stable despite provocations, maintained discipline despite pressure, and operated strategically despite emotional activation. This wasn't eliminating human psychology, it was managing it effectively. Modern environments typically have lower stakes, but basic principle remains valuable. Psychological sovereignty, genuine autonomy in how you respond to circumstances, creates substantial advantage across contexts. Professional, personal, developmental, all benefit from psychological stability rather than reactive volatility. The practical path is systematic capability development. Pick one capability that seems most relevant. Practice deliberately over sustained period. Once it becomes more reliable, add another capability. Over time, capabilities integrate into general psychological sovereignty. Most people never attempt this development because they believe their psychological patterns are fixed aspects of personality. But psychological architecture is largely learned through experience and can be deliberately reconstructed through systematic practice. The alternative is continuing with reactive patterns that create predictable vulnerability. Anyone who understands your trigger response patterns can manipulate your behavior. Any circumstance that activates strong emotions drives automatic responses. You're operating on autopilot rather than with genuine autonomy. Type this commitment. I build psychological sovereignty systematically. If this framework provided value, engage and share. Most people remain psychologically reactive, responding automatically to circumstances rather than developing sovereign architecture. Real autonomy comes from deliberate psychological construction, not personality traits, but developed capabilities that improve through focused practice and create genuine sovereignty in how you respond to circumstances.